Hello, Brad. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, Brad, as an author myself, can I say how much I absolutely loved your book? I think the minute I picked it up, I think what I loved was you don't pretend to have a magic bullet for this massive issue, but you also highlight the nuances in the area. But you have this incredible personability in the book that comes across. It's real, but you bring best practice. And I think it's in ways that parents will find digestible and practical. It's just a fantastic resource. So thank you for this beautiful resource you've given parents.
Oh, thank you, Colette. That's very kind of you. I certainly don't pretend to be an accomplished author, but I gave it a crack anyway.
Yeah, yeah, and you even say that in the book, and I think that's what makes you you come across as honest and personable. So thank you. I remember I was thinking about around 15 years ago, when I first began to notice parents coming to me with concerns about their children spending all night on devices. Eventually, obviously, it was phones and social media. And when I worked as a school psychologist, then I would have principals or head teachers popping their heads into my office saying, what do we do? We've got kids falling asleep on desks, and sometimes they look like they've changed their personality. And I think also what we kind of saw, quite frankly, was this fear mongering. I mean, honestly, the internet was the devil, and none of us in this field really had research guidelines to draw from for
Right.
how we could help kids, me included. We were handing our kids gaming devices, and it felt like this massive social experiment. A lot of fear mongering, of course, happening. And it was kind of like Black Mirror. We were living through our own episodes of Black Mirror those days. We were all figuring this out. And I realized you were too. And I know this because a number of years ago, you and I shared a stage at the
Yes.
Exploring Teens Forum. And you told the story that I saw in your book about how you got into this area. And you hilariously refer to it as the day when suddenly you were it. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. So many years ago, I was working in a child and adolescent mental health unit in a major hospital in Sydney. And, these are sort of great big meetings that they have, and their head psychiatrist, their child psychiatrist, and all these very experienced people. And here's, green psychologist Brad, youngest in the room, probably just trying to stay very quiet. And what they do is they discuss different referrals that have come in and who's going to see them and how they're going to be approached and assigned and whatnot. It's nothing all that dramatic, but essentially, this young man referral came through, and he was, I think, early teens, and he was really stuck on Harry Potter. It was an online world that he'd immersed himself in. And essentially, it wasn't even a game. It was just like a website where he was playing along a role. And so he'd taken this role of a teacher at Hogwarts. And so as the team were discussing who's going to see this young man, because he'd stopped going to school and he was getting quite aggressive and just things were going downhill for him. All of a sudden, everyone was very quiet as to who was going to see him. And then the very senior professor at the time said, well, Brad, you're it. And I kind of lifted my head and I said, what do you mean I'm it? And he said, well, you game, don't you? And I mean, yeah, I'm a young child psychologist. I'm male. Like, I mean, I have gamed. I do kind of still at that time. And he said, well, you're it because you know more about this than anyone else does here. And
Wow.
that was literally how I got started in this path, that it was not some grand plan for me, some almost 15 years later to obviously I am the director of the Screens and Gaming Disorder Clinic. And I'm doing a PhD research in this area now as well. And I've written a parenting book, but yeah, I didn't plan any of that. I was just literally in the right place at the right time, I suppose.
Incredible. That makes me think of sometimes we hear about your calling chooses you. You kind of to me look like the poster child for that. So for me, the opposite side of the fear mongering, then I think you and I both experienced this when teachers and psychologists sometimes they get comments by parents that say something like, oh, for goodness sake, I played Atari computer games when I was a kid and I turned out just fine. What's the issue? So, what do you say when parents or adults say that to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, we could talk about this all day. I could completely geek out on this, but the main thing that I point out to parents is that If you look at some of the functional MRI studies, so brain mapping and whatnot, and the reason I refer to these studies, Colette, more recently, not when we shared a stage many years ago because they weren't around, but
Yes,
the reason
yes.
yeah, they are now, a few of them anyway. But the reason I refer to them is because they're fairly irrefutable by the gaming industry. So what I mean by that is many other studies that don't use functional MRI or neurological markers, the gaming industry will find a way to shout them down. But
Okay.
with these sorts of studies, what we found is that if you do a functional MRI for a child or an adult for that matter, and you give them an offline game versus an online game, what they found is that there's a much bigger dopamine response to online gaming. So fundamentally, what I did in the 80s and 90s and what most parents these days still would have done is offline gaming. You're just playing the computer
Yes.
versus now it's a much more social interactive thing. And it doesn't matter whether it's a child's best friend from school or some guy that they've met or some random person from America. There's still a much bigger dopamine effect. And that's one of the many reasons, but the main reason why gaming these days, has a much bigger addictive quality.
Right. So, yep, and I appreciate in our field how neuroscience really has lent its or kind of put its weight behind a lot of things that we've been saying. So, thank you for highlighting that. I know that we both agree that tech use is very much entwined with our teens' social world and social interactions. And you've already mentioned that how, some of the kids play online with their friends. The rule in our home has always been devices in public areas. So my youngest is 14, and I watch him chatting and laughing with all sorts of, all his mates, often not even game related.
Right.
Our gaming area is kind of where I cook anyway. So, and that's a bit of fun to watch. And he plays PlayStation. Side note, I get that there's a big rivalry between PlayStation and Xbox. My eldest used to play Xbox. I mean, a bit of it is just, I think, depending on what your friends play. And because you can't cross platforms with games, I learned. Um, so I know it's not the case of banning all tech. And as if we could. But one of the main questions, and probably the reason why someone I think is listening to this episode right now, is how do I know if my teen has crossed over from healthy use to addictive use of technology? So, in your words, when should I panic?
Yeah. So, I mean, I pointed this out in my book, and it's still even more relevant today than it was back there. That people use the term gaming addiction or internet addiction. It's not because I'm endorsing that term. We should just say
Thank you.
typically these days we call it gaming disorder or internet gaming disorder, depending on which book you're listening to. But to answer the question of just when should parents be concerned, there are two markers here, if you will. So at the top end, we do again have functional MRI studies out of the United States in 2019. There was a big longitudinal study, 10,000 kids over 4 years, that
Massive.
basically found that when you go over 7 hours of recreational screen use a day. Now, I want to point out to parents, this is really important. I'm not talking about 7 hours of gaming. I'm talking about 7 hours of recreational screen use, whether it's YouTube or Discord or social media or Snapchat or Fortnite or whatever. It doesn't matter. 7 hours of recreational screen use. When you go over that, the authors of this study found that the brain cortex was thinning prematurely in kids. So,
Incredible.
that's neurological impacts that I would suggest are not ideal. Now, do we know whether that can be reversible or not? I guess we'll find out in 10 years when we revisit that. But for me and my kids, I wouldn't be getting anywhere near that. So at a
Yeah.
top level, 7 hours. Now, a lot of
And
families
that's,
say,
yeah,
oh,
that
well,
is massive. That's massive.
right.
So
Yeah. Well, a lot of
thank you for
families say,
saying, yeah. So thank you for saying that my kids wouldn't get anywhere near that. But yep, we have to have a kind of guideline.
right, absolutely. So at the top end, if you've got kids that come to my clinic and it's a real problem, 7 hours in a school holidays, for example, in a day is the maximum. Now,
Yeah.
I often talk to parents about other warning signs. So when gaming or screens is impacting their education, their behavior, their social life, their sleep or exercise. All of
Yeah.
these things are, things that I take parents through in my book and my videos about their other warning signs. Now, in my experience, that can be impacted at 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, who knows? It's different for every kid.
Right. So in my other episodes, I talk about general cyber safety, and so we've kind of touched a bit now on time. Can you talk about how online addiction is different then to general topics on cyber safety?
I'm really glad you asked that question, Colette, because I think this is something that is really confused by politicians, by health bureaucrats and whatnot. There is a big push in the last 10, 15 years about cyber safety, and rightly so. It's a very
Yes.
important topic. But I think that that gets confused with overuse or gaming disorder or internet disorder or just problematic use of too much. There is an overlap in my experience in the sense that a child that is on screens, say 7 or 8 hours a day in the middle of the night, no rules and boundaries around it, in their bedroom and whatnot, they are more likely to get into cyber safety problems as well. Not as a rote rule of
Okay.
thumb, but just in general, if you think about it, 2 a.m. messaging allows for some more less transparency, but at the same time, they are very different. And so I do feel like we've made this conscious effort and push to educate parents and put a lot of strategies in place around cyber safety, but we haven't really done much as far as overuse. And that's the crossroads that Australia is at the moment, because every other, well, not every other country, but many other countries around the world, if you look at, say, Singapore or Hong Kong, the UK, Belgium, they all have dedicated addiction centers, quote unquote, or overuse
Yes.
treatment centers, and they've got a collaborated way that for right from research through to political motivation. But in Australia, there's just none of that. So we're really struggling.
Wow. Wow. So there's a massive need there then. In your book, you talk about cyber contracts, and I've spoken to thousands of parents about cyber contracts and boundaries, and I especially appreciate how you say in your book there isn't a cookie cutter, one size fits all for every child, because that doesn't work for every child.
Right.
Just talk to us a little bit about how you approach the contract idea with parents.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, so I was just speaking with one of the other psychologists in the screens and gaming disorder clinic, and talking to him about this very issue. And the reason that we do it on a whiteboard in the clinic for families is because it does have to be changeable. And I guess
Yes.
I've commented many times and been on the record that in my experience, when you have a child or a teen that gets one of those cookie cutter off the internet, this will solve your child's problem, let them sign this contract, they are going to run for the hills. They
Yes.
will not sign that, most of them. And if they do sign it, then they're usually the kids you probably ironically don't have to worry about so much. So I guess my approach is more to encourage parents to do it as more of an organic thing. Now, I know that still means it needs structure and they need guidance. And so I take parents through how to do that. But essentially, what I mean is trying to come to some agreement with a child about their recreational use and where the boundaries are, when the internet's going to go on and off, and how we're going to do that on weekdays versus weekends versus holidays. And we try to do that in an organic way on a piece of paper or a whiteboard and then just take a photo of it.
I love that, and I think I've even said to parents that's going to even change with your child's age, because
Yes.
they may be now using social media, which they weren't when they were 11, 12. So those kind of things change, and so even in your own home, because you'll have different ranges of ages of your children, you will have different contracts that will evolve for each child. So thank you for just lending your weight to that. So in light of that, what do parents say then when they have a child who just says, "I will not hand over my device," or "I won't get off my game"? I think a lot of parents struggle getting their kids off of a gaming device. What do you advise?
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of those issues where I feel like a lot of my colleagues and I differ. I think there's many people that would speak in this space that would advocate that the parents should just take devices, just take the device off them, just be a parent. And to me, that's the most unhelpful advice a parent can get. I think it gets quite stressful. And if I'm honest, that advice usually works for primary school kids. We're seeing younger and younger boys. So once they get to year 4, year 5, quite often that results in physical aggression, stuff getting broken,
Okay.
really stressful stuff. Now, I want to just put some context around this as well. If we look at Australian schools, the incident rates or the prevalence, as we call it, of how many kids have gaming disorder or internet gaming disorder is about 1 to 3% of Australian kids. Okay. Now,
Okay.
again, if you think about this as a problem for Australia, there are some 5 million kids in Australia. You're talking about up to 50,000 that have a diagnosable clinical disorder in this. Now, the research also tells us in Australian schools that up to 10% are at risk or have problematic use or hazardous use. So 10% again is 500,000. So I'm not talking about the 90%. There might be 90% of parents that say, I can just take the device off my kid. They give their phone in, that's fine. I'm talking more about the 10%. And again, that's not a small number. So my advice to those families and what I've found works best in the clinic is to actually focus a little bit more on controlling the Wi-Fi, because without the Wi-Fi, those devices are fairly useless.
Yes.
And so we do that through various different modems and whatnot. And in parents' defense, I think lots of parents have tried to do this and been sold some software or something that claims to be able to do this, and the child can get around it really easy. So I think it's really stressful for parents because they have great intentions and they think they're doing the right thing by taking some software and realize that their 10-year-old can get around it very quickly. So, but in a broad answer to your question, rather than taking devices, especially when they head towards the teenage years, we move more towards managing the Wi-Fi.
All right. And so, in terms of some of the things you've said there now, you mentioned when parents come to your clinic. What brings parents to your clinic? Is it referrals, self referrals, referrals from schools? How do you end up having parents arrive at your clinics?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think that, when you and I first met, I had a wait list in the gaming and screens disorder clinic for something like maybe 2 months. And these days it's more like 6 months, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah,
some of that is a function of COVID and the lockdowns but typically the reason that prompts parents or GPs or school counselors to refer to me, or quite often it's other psychologists that just sort of have tried but are not quite sure what to do in these situations. But it's typically around concerns from school. So if a child is not doing their homework, is staying up late, is school refusing because of gaming and screens, or it's behavioural. So that, in the
okay,
most extreme cases, that can be police coming out because there's an AVO, because there's violence when you try to take screens, or even just, I mean, not just, but holes in walls, things breaking,
yes,
that kind of aggression, and so typically that ramps up at the end of primary school or the start of high school. And that would be the usual sort of pathway that would prompt a family to me. And we're seeing more and more sort of interstate and international referrals now,
okay,
which is interesting. But I guess it just shows you again that the demand there, if you think about that 10%, I would put it to you, Colette, that in any other health area, if it had a subclinical prevalence of 10%, politicians and health
yes,
bureaucrats would be doing something huge about this, but the reality is they're not. So,
yeah, okay,
parents unfortunately are left to come to private clinics like mine. And again, I'm on the record as saying that if we had a public clinic in Australia and a public response to this, it may well put me out of business, and I would be the happiest man, because I don't think this should be something that only parents who can afford a private clinic should be able to get help for.
yeah, yeah, exactly right. So, Brad, what would you say to a parent who's listening and is really struggling? What hope can you bring them in this area?
I mean, look, so in my latest research that I'm doing with my colleague, Professor Wayne Warburton at Macquarie, who's just fantastic at
I
this.
love Wayne. He's
Yeah,
incredible.
Wayne's great. So Wayne and I, Professor Kangas as well, released a paper recently that really hones in on the early intervention in primary school. That this sort of stuff has to be thought about, and healthy boundaries put in place early. And if we do that, we can reduce the severity of the symptoms or the problems that occur in high school. So what we found essentially is that the amount of symptoms, the difficulties get a lot greater when a child moves to high school, especially boys. And so we have to be thinking about this earlier. And so my next paper and research project is, in fact, what they call a clinical trial, so a randomized control trial of that. So we'll be taking some primary school kids and some, high school kids, and just comparing there. So I guess to answer your question directly, though, for me, for parents, even if you don't have an untenable situation right now, or any of the concerns that I've talked about, because you've got a child that's in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, that's the time to be putting in these practices now, because that is a great insurance policy for later. And again, that's not me trying to be an alarmist, or act like every child's going to end up there, but it just seems like a fairly common sense approach from me.
And so for the high school parents, parents of teens, um, what hope can we bring them?
Look, it can be really tricky. I think for parents that are sitting there saying, well, my child's already there, they've already got the behavioral or social difficulties, or disengaging with school, or, up late at night, it can be really hard. And I think that, again, we are increasing the amount of support services, but it's still really difficult. I would encourage them to seek out their school counselor, or their GP, or another psychologist, a child psychologist, because while I say that there are not many people that know much about this, we are getting better. I try my best to do as much training as I can. In fact, in the next couple of months, I'll be training a couple of hundred GPs in New South
Fantastic.
Wales. And so we're trying to get the message out there, because what we so often hear from parents of teenagers is that when they go to access help, so often they're told by health professionals, or police, or anyone, or teachers, that this is normal and kids game and it's
Yeah.
fine. And that's
Okay.
so invalidating for parents that are dealing with
Yeah.
this and know that this is not normal,
Yeah.
for 10% anyway.
Okay. So it's them trying to find or seeking out professionals, and I suppose the fact that we now have access to telehealth is brilliant, because even if parents are listening to this and they're in regional areas, seeking out a psychologist or a GP who has some skill in this would be more accessible to them today.
Correct. And, I mean, I'm not the only one, as much as I say that there's difficulties here accessing services. So there's a child psychiatrist in Adelaide by the name of Dr. Kim Lee, and he is fantastic at gaming stuff, and he does telehealth as well. And so there are services out there, but it's a bit of a minefield, and it's difficult for parents to locate them. But again, with telehealth, you can access Dr. Kim Lee, which you couldn't have done 2 years ago,
Yes.
who's
Yes.
probably the foremost expert doctor in this field in Australia, for me anyway.
Okay. And so finally, Brad, what is your hope for the work that you do, and the young people that you work with?
What a fantastic question. I kind of, if I'm really honest, Colette, I oscillate between just sort of sticking my head down and helping the families that I can, and then every now and then I get angry. I get
Okay.
angry that we're not doing enough. I get angry that, and frustrated maybe is a better word than angry, but I get frustrated that
That's all right.
there's no political motivation in this country. I've tried several politicians, no one wants to talk to me. There's no movement for me, and this is going to be controversial. Some people will disagree with me, but I don't feel like the E-Safety Commission pays much attention to this either. I think they're
Okay.
focused on cyber safety. And so my hope, to answer your question, is that we actually come about a concerted way of managing this in this country. And what I mean by that is there needs to be more funding for research. At the end of the day, the research I referred to before that I'm doing, I get nothing for that. I'm doing that out of my
Wow.
own pocket. I'm taking time off my own clinic and from my family to do that. I will lose a lot of money. But there's no funding research. If you go to Europe, they get $1 million grants for this stuff, right? So there's no education, there's no research, there's no political impetus for it. It's a whole range of things that need to happen along with providing early intervention and treatment options. These are all things that countries like Belgium, the UK just opened up a treatment center. Singapore, I did a conference with one of the head doctors of the Singapore addictions clinic. They have a clinic there. He couldn't believe when I said to him, we don't have outpatient or inpatient treatment services for this. There's nothing in Australia.
Okay.
So we're so far behind that I kind of oscillate between getting, defeated and then getting frustrated and moving on it. But I'm hoping in the next couple of years that some people in higher places than I will I guess push for change.
Okay. Thank you. So, Brad, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for suddenly being it and, taking on the challenge and caring for these young people. And yeah, my hope for you is that that we do see change in Australia in this area, but especially just thank you on behalf of the parents for what you do for their kids.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.